How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. The road to Grondell led through a dense forest, dark and wet enough to remind Pierce of the Underlands. He shivered and felt the need to wash. Then he puzzled at himself. Though his time in that subterranean realm had not been pleasant, he found he was not loath to return to it. In fact, a part of him was excited that this adventure might deliver him there again. Maybe I'm too brash, he thought. Do the others think I'm just a stupid kid letting my imagination run off with me? They hadn't argued much with him when he defended the possibility of using the skill of folding to cross the chasm. Did that mean he'd affected their opinions on the matter? Or were they just dismissing him, refusing to discuss further in an effort to end his prattling? He'd been aware for some years now that he talked a lot, that he tended to wander down mental rabbit trails, often leaving other people behind. In general, he found others were annoyed by this, and when he remembered, he apologized. But often he was too engrossed in his thoughts to do so. They were like a flood, lapping at a river's banks, seeking new paths across strange lands. Now that he knew about folding, he really might consider studying the glorious paths in earnest. Could he just skip to the 10th skill? Or was there some fatal trap along the way that required mastery over a preceding skill? He'd encountered his fair share of booby traps in the wild reaches of Overland, traps that could have been circumvented by the throw of a switch or the deciphering of some ancient clue. None had yet killed him. Would skipping skills be the thing that finally did him in? Or maybe he could just learn really, really fast. Sometimes things just came to him, especially physical skills. Growing up, the very week he learned to play hurtball with the other boys, he rose in their ranks to be team captain. It just came naturally to him, unlike careful learning and study. It did occur to him in passing that formal education could be another adventure, however tame, waiting for him to conquer it and claim its spoils. Maybe there'll be time someday, he thought. Now is the time for action, he said aloud. What? Agrathor asked from astride his Raptorian. I was just thinking about trying scholarship again when all this is over, Pierce replied. Agrathor grunted, or made a sound kind of like a grunt. If we live. Oh, I doubt anything could kill you, sir. If that Gorgon... But I don't want to be alone here, Agrathor bellowed. What would I do if Cash won and everyone else died? Join him? Keep trying to kill him? Bah! Once again, Pierce had aggravated the skeleton man, and he pulled his mount up ahead to join Axeborn and Scythia. Pierce was slowly getting a better grip on Agrathor's demeanour. At first he thought the man a warrior's warrior, brutal and professional to a fault. He thought Agrathor had just been giving him a hard time to put Pierce through his paces, initiate him. With each passing day, he saw more and more that Agrathor was a truly passionate man, fiercely dedicated to his friends and his calling. Pierce was beginning to think that when anything touched on his meatless condition, the man's anger stemmed not so much from feeling insulted, but from being reminded that he had lost a vital connection to the rest of humanity, his flesh. Pierce silently pledged to be more sensitive toward the man's loss. He was still thinking over how he would tackle life as a skeleton when the bandits attacked. There were few things a person could attempt in Overland more foolish than trying to rob Gorgonbane. But Pierce had to hand it to these bandits. They started with a pretty good plan. First, he heard the whistle of darts shooting through the air, and all of the Raptorians squealed in pain and surprise as several darts hit each of them at once. Pierce's mount, who he had named Gash, turned its head towards him with a look of pleading, just before its eyes glazed over and crumpled beneath him in sedated slumber. Pierce leapt free and immediately scanned the forest around them for threats. All the Raptorians were down, but Axeborn and Agrathor were both on their feet, falling together into a two-sided defensive stance, weapons drawn. Pierce pulled down his faceplate and edged up the road to join them and form a triangle. Scythia's bloodhoof Nova had bleated when the darts hit it, but it showed no signs of collapse, or indeed of injury. There were no darts embedded in its hide. Must be tough. Scythia spurred it into a patrol pattern around the three guys. S had no mount. She had simply been levitating as they travelled and had risen up into the forest canopy to do reconnaissance. A second volley of poison darts flew in from all sides, and this time Pierce saw them actually bounce off Nova's hide. Amazing. He felt a few careen off his armour too. When next he saw Agrathor, several feathered missiles had become lodged in between his few exposed bones. His flame eyes swelled in anger. 5 on the northeast, 7 to the southwest, S called from up above. Darts and arrows were flying up at her from the brush below, but some strange force caused them to fall in an arc before their velocity should have been exhausted. "I am loath to call the lightning," cried Agrathor. "It does not seem necessary or prudent to burn the forest down." "You speak true, friend," Axeborn returned. "Yes, cut off their southern retreat. Agrathor, take the 5. Scythia will cover the northward road." "And me, sir?" Pierce asked. A dart flew right at his face and he deflected it with his blade. "Come with me. We'll take the 7. Pierce nodded and the group broke up. S sent her orbs every which way, providing destructive cover fire for her comrades. Pierce watched one of the orbs crash through the trunk of a tree, splitting it at the point of impact. It swung down from above, fibers holding until the treetop impacted the ground. Someone in the underbrush screamed. "One down!" S called. The shadows flared blue as Agrathor released electric rage on the other side of the road. The bandits ahead of Axeborn and Pierce ceased firing their darts and stepped out of hiding. 2 dropped down from the branches above. They were well dressed for bandits, in clean leathers and holding polished swords and axes. This must have been a lucrative stretch of road for them. Not today. Axeborn signalled that he would take the left flank. There were 4 men that way. This left 3 for Pierce. Axeborn reached his prey first. One of them tried to dodge around a thick tree to get behind Axeborn, but the big man planted a vicious standing kick in the tree trunk that ripped fibre from fibre, almost as clean as if it had been chopped with the world's sharpest axe. Thousands of pounds of living wood slammed into the bandit's body and the tree fell down on top of him. 2? Axeborn bellowed. He grinned at the next 3. They fell back several paces, widening their formation. "You guys should probably leave," Pierce called to the 3 bandits in front of him. One stepped forward instead and swung a single-edged claymore at him. Far too slow. Pierce sidestepped and brought his blue blade up swiftly, severing the man's hands at his wrist. His heavy sword clattered to the ground and he cried out in shock, falling to the ground and clutching at his wrist stumps. "Pierce got 3, S called from somewhere above. One of her orbs shot between tree branches and blew through the bandit's chest, ending his misery. The other 2 approached Pierce cautiously. One of them was very heavy-set and almost as tall as Pierce. "4!" came Agrathor's rasping voice. "5!" boomed Axeborn from nearby. The heavy bandit brought his battle axe down in a crushing blow. An ordinary man could not have parried it, but Pierce's training and natural gift saw him through. The bone melter sliced through the axe's very blade, bisecting it, and Pierce fired his blast gauntlet with his offhand, blowing apart the man's arm below the elbow. He fell to the muddy ground, irrationally trying to collect the pieces of his ruined limb and screaming. His fervour quickly faded as shock took him and he began to bleed out. Pierce watched the next man carefully, dark islets unreadable. Then his final bandit turned and fled, and Pierce gave chase. The man was fast. 9! Axborn growled from behind him. Somehow Pierce had missed the last few counts. The running man hit the hard-packed road and abandoned his sword, fleeing south in panic. Another bandit from Agrithor's side joined him, but they didn't even give each other a glance. Pierce could run all day, but blind panic lent the bandits speed. He wasn't sure he'd catch them without using the blast gauntlet for a little boost. He needn't worry. S lowered herself closer to the ground in front of the fleeing bandits, her 7 liquid orbs floating around her in strange patterns. Her robe began to billow around her at the behest of some unseen force that also stirred the dust of the road. She brought her hands up, letting her drooping sleeves fall away, and Pierce couldn't help but notice how slender and enticingly feminine they were. She had painted the nails white in strong contrast to her jet black skin. His masculine stupor was dispelled when she stretched her hands out to either side, palms up, and violently closed them into fists. The last 2 bandits screamed in a duet of pain, but the screams were cut short as fountains of blood and bone erupted from the place where they'd been. The sound was like that of a butcher, gutting every hog in the shop simultaneously. A mixture of cutting, ripping, and crushing all at once. Pierce had never heard anything like it, and immediately his image of S shifted into a more multifaceted thing than it had previously been. She was no dainty doll. The moment stretched long, and the gore of the bandits seemed to hang in the air before falling in a splattering rain to the dry dirt. Somewhere squirrels and rodents fled, rustling leaves and twigs. The rest of Gorgonbane met back at the road. Pierce was frozen in awe of S. Agrithor came up behind and slapped his shoulder, grinning. 12! He grated. Though rendered unconscious, the Raptorians were unharmed. Nevertheless, Gorgonbane was forced to make camp for the night while they waited for the sedatives to wear off. No one else had been hurt. They were all seated around a cookfire built up the roadside, roasting meat from a freshly hunted wild boar on long, pointy sticks. Why would they even try? Pierce asked. He'd always considered himself a decent person, but even if he had been some kind of criminal or ruffian, and even if he somehow hadn't known who Gorgonbane were, there was no way he would have attacked such an obviously well-armed group. Some people think only with their eyes, son, Axborn said. His big lips were pulled to one side in a contemplative smirk. Some with their bellies. Some with their pants, added Scythia. Yes, Axborn agreed. Not everyone is as present in life's moments as you are. Surely you must have noticed this before. Pierce nodded, non-committally. Well, I suppose, he said. I guess it still just doesn't make sense to me. Probably won't ever, said Agrithor. Who can account for foolishness? One man's reason is another man's folly. And some are just desperate to survive, said S. They think that no matter the risk, if just this one roll of the dice comes up favourably, it could be the last big break they ever need. So, they commit, under the chasm, with the consequences. Pierce considered that. Had he ever been that desperate? Many times he'd thought that death had finally come for him, but at that point nearly any risk was worth taking, if it meant keeping one's life. He didn't think he'd ever been so desperate for something more mundane. That really was something, he said to S. You've said, she smiled. About 10 times, Agrithor grumbled. Hey, let the man be impressed, S chided. I have been working alone quite often of late. Without the affirmation of sycophants, those in the grand halls of discovery enjoy. I could use the praise. Which skill was that? Pierce asked. What you used to kill them? S shook her head. None of them. Merely an intermediate application of biologically oriented telekinesis. Intermediate? Pierce asked in disbelief. What is advanced? S shrugged, almost imperceptibly in the mountain of her robes. Greater numbers, wider range, moving things with mass substantially greater than mine. Pierce thought that funny. The slender, young-looking mage seemed quite petite in her generous coverings. What constituted a substantial ratio? That thought amuses you, she said, favouring him with bright eyes. It is true I am not a large person, he blushed. But when S says substantial, Axborn said, she means it. Push the word to its limits and a little further, and that's what you get when S uses it. Yet Scythia had said that Agrathor was likely the most powerful of the four of them. Pierce couldn't make it compute, but since it concerned the testy skeleton man, he decided not to pursue it for now. They ate their boar meat in near silence after that, and the quiet of deepening night gave way to the nocturnal sounds of the dense forest. The blood-red sun baked Pierce awake, stealing through breaks in the forest canopy. The others were already up. Likely Agrathor, at least, had not slept at all. Someone had gotten the Raptorians on their feet, but they still looked a bit bleary-eyed, so Pierce had been allowed to sleep late while they finished recovering from the sedatives they'd been shot with. It was nearly mid-morning before Gorgonbane set out again, leaving the unfortunate remains of the unnamed bandits to the scavengers of the forest. Within a few hours, the forest relinquished its hold on the land, and the road to Grondel wound between a pair of low hills crowned with the ruins of old watchtowers. It looked like a wall and gate had once stood here, guarding the road, but now the rubble and wreckage were overgrown with brush and brambles. From there it was a swift jaunt down the road as it threaded through ever-rising hills to the grand old city of Grondel. Standing tall on its mesa, Pierce had been there before, but not for long, and never in such stylish company. The mighty gates of Grondel stood open to the pilgrims that flowed toward the old city from the lands without. In any season, thousands of devout would travel there to work, pray, or learn in the everlasting temple, and the sub-temples, libraries, colleges, and shrines that had grown up around it. There were people here from all corners of Overland. All were welcome. And on the surface at least, there was no distinction made between one parishioner and the next. Gorgonbane attracted many looks of curiosity as they rode up to the city gates and passed through. Even among many thousands, the living legends were well known by their descriptions. And besides this, they were travelling with a levitating wizard and an animated skeleton. They were bound to attract attention anywhere they went. Grondel was fashioned all of a peculiar stone. The high defensive walls were made of blocks of wood that had been shaped, engraved, petrified by magic and set in place. The surface of each block shimmered with a pale gold light of enchantment, preventing erosion, hardening the stone against impacts and foreign magic. The gates were likewise enchanted and were massive things. Thick bronze monoliths opened and closed by fearsome engines. Pierce thought that if the Underlord's forces merely attempted some conventional attack, there was no way they would breach this ancient place. Certainly no one ever had. Grondel was consistently disorganized in the way of many old cities, but most people living there or visiting were intimately familiar with it. Pierce would have been lost here, for though he'd been before, he'd never really learned the place. But his companions and everyone else he saw seemed to know exactly where they were going, and what switchbacks, alleys, tunnels and overpasses to use to get there. He was happy to follow along, although he did think it could be interesting to get lost here on purpose. There was no telling what stories or mysteries he might encounter off the beaten path. Axborn had indicated that the city garrison's officers had their headquarters near Grondel's heart, the everlasting temple itself, and this is where Gorgonbane was currently headed. Near the temple, visitors looked more refined, if not necessarily higher in class. Men and women wore robes woven with patterns in the temple's own colour palette: reds, golds, silvers and oranges. Everyone was fresh-faced, clean and washed, and looked well-fed. The streets here were also more organised, fanning out from the temple in concentric circles that were connected with short byways. Between the rings of streets stood smaller temples, shrines, lush gardens, clean taverns, and various shops and apartments. In the middle of it all squatted the Holy Temple of Everlasting Transcendence. It was taller than the buildings around it, but not the highest building Pierce had ever seen by far. Most of its mass came from its wideness, sprawled across the breadth and length of its grounds. Within that smallest circular street at the city's heart, very little space was left unoccupied by the temple. It was made of the same petrified wood as Grondel's outer walls, and its form consisted of short, narrow towers, square libraries, glass-roofed chapels, and long stretches of galleries, every element connected to its neighbours by claustrophobic hallways or tunnels through outcroppings of rock. Another place to come get lost in. Pierce considered again. He really might like to come here and study someday. The grandness of the place alone might hold him in a consistent enough state of awe and wonder to keep his mind on schoolwork. In the northeast quadrant of the second ring stood the city garrison's officers, and Axborn boldly led his small team up long steps to their entrance. He stopped them there briefly. "All right, we're all going in together, mostly as a show of force. A little shock and awe will help us get their attention," he said. "But you," he pointed at Pierce, "and you," he pointed at Agrathor, "keep your mouths shut. No musings, ruminations, or tangents." He fixed his gaze on Pierce. "And no arguments or complaints," he gave Agrathor a stern look. "We need to present a unified front, or no one will believe us, and they certainly won't listen to us." The rest of Gorgonbane saluted. Pierce nodded, flinched slightly, then saluted as well. "Good," said Axborn. "Then come, let's go in." He led the way through a pair of wooden double doors, and the group was immediately questioned by a clerk at a high desk in the lobby they entered. "What can I help you with?" The clerk was a polished-looking man in his 40s, with bronze skin and short black hair. He wore a pair of oval spectacles that glowed green with enchantment. "We haven't called for any mercenaries this season." He looked dubious. Axborn strode up to the clerk's desk and clasped his arm in greeting. "Good day, young man," he said. Immediately the clerk's face softened a bit. "I need to speak with your garrison commander. My comrades and I have discovered intelligence regarding an attack on the city." The clerk's dubious look returned, and he released Axborn's arm. "Oh, well, we got one of those last week, so you'll pardon my skepticism. Little merc band running away from some of their rivals. They wanted us to shut the gates so their rivals would have no choice but to abandon the chase. Good try, though." He lowered his eyes to some paperwork on the desktop. "We are not mercenaries, sir," Axborn said, just a slight hardness to his voice. The clerk looked back up. "Not today, anyway. Nor do we have any rivals. I do strive to remain tactful in these situations, so would you kindly glance at my comrades and tell me what you see?" The clerk looked up, scanning Scythia in all her hard beauty, S buried in her magenta robes, Pierce smiling, faceplate up. Then he saw Agrathor and gasped. Yes, Axborn said, a teacher witnessing the spark of understanding in his student. We are, he said it as a leading question. Gordonbane, said the clerk. I never thought I'd... Yes, sir. Mr. Axborn, sir? Or is it Mr. Cleaver? I'll go find the commander this instant. I do believe he's in from the barracks inspection. The clerk fairly floated across the lobby and through a guarded double doors, leading deeper into the building. Axborn smiled. I harbour no addiction to fame, but I really do love it when they realise who they're talking to. The variety of reactions all within the same vein is truly astounding, said Scythia. The clerk returned after a few minutes, holding the doors open and waiting. Commander Thorn will see you. He says his office is too small, so I'm taking you out to the courtyard, said the clerk. He led the way and Gorgonbane followed. The courtyard was simple, but tastefully adorned with a pebbled path around its perimeter, a short cropped lawn within, and a single fountain of sculpted petrified wood that wasn't currently running. Wooden benches were placed intermittently along the path, and Thorn stood near one of these. The commander was about Axborn's age, scars on his dark face calling back to times of war. He shaved his head bald and his skin had the pallor of someone afflicted with blood waste. Awful disease that, Pierce thought. His grandfather had perished of it. Hail, Gorgonbane, he greeted. To what do I owe the pleasure? When they had come close enough, they each clasped his arm in turn. To Cash and his infernal minions, Agrathor muttered. Axborn gave him a look. We have learned of ill intentions toward the city, said Axborn. Would that we could greet you with better news, but it seems that the Underlord has developed the means and the desire to bring an attack force to bear on Overland. As we understand it, Grondel is to be his initial target. Well, that's not good, said Commander Thorn. Are you sure? How can you know? Cash has never been one to announce his plans to us Overlanders. Pierce Gems Waster was prisoner of the Pain Reapers for a time, Scythia said, and the commander's eyes widened. They were foolish enough to speak of Cash's plans in his presence, and to allow his escape from the Testadel. Gem Waster? Pierce asked. It sounded better than Boon Swaddled, but... Well, I saw you blow through 5 of them fighting that monstrosity, she said. I assume there were at least another 5 before that. Some might consider firing the gauntlet into thin air a waste. Pierce shrugged in acceptance. Still, it's not very brutal, he said. Axborn cleared his throat. Sorry, said Scythia. Sorry, said Pierce. And how did he escape? Thorn was not dubious, but genuinely curious. A Forge Master let me out, Commander, Pierce said. Thorn looked at Axborn, who nodded in assent. Pierce was to be believed. Why would a Forge Master do that? Thorn asked. Because I could have killed him, but I spared his life, Pierce said. I didn't really go down to the Underlands to kill anyone in particular, I just wanted to bring back something special. He patted the pommel of his sword as he said this. Commander Thorn shook his head slowly. I hear you, and I want to believe you, Agrathor began to growl. You're heroes. I should believe you, but it's just all so out of the ordinary. He looked closely at Pierce. Do you have proof? Show him the bone melter, said Scythia. Let its light shine bright. Pierce drew the sword obediently, and its intense blue light shone starkly against all the other colours of the world. This is what I brought back, he said. Agrathor backed away uneasily. It's a bone melter, Thorn asked, bending close to study the thing, daring not to touch it. Pierce nodded. They call it that, but it pretty much cuts anything like butter in my experience. Thorn caught Pierce's eyes. "Can I see it?" he asked. "Sure," said Pierce. "Got a bone?" Commander Thorn called out to a guard on the other side of the courtyard, ordering him to send for a bone. The guard looked puzzled but obeyed. A runner returned with a hog's spine, handing it over to the commander. Pierce looked at him in question, but Thorn just shrugged. They lay the spine on the wooden bench and Pierce applied his sword to it, melting the bone with the faintest bit of contact. Agrathor looked away, tapping a bony finger against his armour nervously. "Alright, well, get the picture?" Pierce said, pulling the sword off the bone before it had fully melted. He wanted to spare poor Agrathor the discomfort. "You're not going to finish?" Thorn asked. It was an awesome thing to see. Clearly he wanted to witness the whole process. Pierce didn't answer him. "Sorry about that, Agrathor. It's over." The skeleton man turned back around and his flame eyes rounded and dimmed. He didn't say anything, but Pierce sensed his relief. "So," Axborn said, addressing Thorn, "the kid shows up in Nux, kills a monstrosity by himself, shows us the Forge Master's tool, and it's enchanted with a colour hardly anyone's ever seen. You believe he was in the Underlands yet?" "Not to mention that all of Gorgonbane vouches for his authenticity," said Agrathor. The commander came to a decision. "Okay then, what do you think I should do?" "Give command of the garrison to me," Axborn said, without hesitation. Commander Thorn balked. That's unheard of. How can you even ask?" "There will be something different about this attack," said Scythia. The Pain Reaper's words suggested as much, as does the unheard of nature of the plan. "We have seen and won battles that you and your men can only imagine, and have only heard about in tales." "And we do not mean to offend," said S, "nor to claim any glory for ourselves, but I assure you, this will be the best for your men and for your city. I know that it isn't easy, but think on our reputation. Rarely would I deign to invoke it, but I invoke it now. Would we do anything to harm or hinder your survival?" Thorn searched each of their eyes in turn. Pierce didn't envy the man this decision. It was a highly irregular, perhaps even impudent request. No one, however mighty, strode into a fortified city full of thousands of people and simply requested to be given full control of its defensive forces. By all rights, the man should refuse. Thorn's eyes rested on Pierce last. He smiled as winsomely as he could, making an effort to look trustworthy. Did it work, or did it make him look fake? "All right," Commander Thorn said. "It worked. You'll be advising me. We'll draw up a mock battle in the war room. Let me get the men in place. Set the divisions as I see fit. Then I hand over chief command to you. The men will refer to you as General. Deal?" "Deal," Axborn said. He looked relieved. "How long do we have?" Thorn asked. Pierce unfolded his fingers one at a time. 10 days, said Scythia. Gorgonbane waited as their places were prepared in the machine that was the garrison. Commander Thorn asked them to enjoy his courtyard garden and had food brought in. Pierce wondered if he was the only one that was fidgety. The threat was just too close now, and he found himself anxious to just get to the fighting. This didn't dampen his appetite in the least, and as he waited, he thought back to Sugar's spicy meat pies. Alongside that thought came a parallel craving for something to do. Axborn and Scythia were sitting together on a stone bench, just holding each other's hands and watching time pass by. Pierce came near and squatted down, giving them a chance to acknowledge him. When they didn't, he spoke up. "So, Axborn, sir, he said. Axborn turned his head, eyes cool and calm. How could he be this calm? Wasn't he itching to fight too? So I've always heard you called the Cleaver. Of course, everyone knows about the 1,000 Gen you beheaded, but I don't think I've ever heard the story told right. I'll take this one, said Scythia with a sly grin. Of course, my darling, Axborn said. I'll keep my mouth shut, though I'm sure you'll share my turn with me. Scythia shrugged. Everything one's husband shares tastes sweeter. Axborn scowled playfully at her. This is why you're always eating my meals. And drinking your drinks, and borrowing your thick, fluffy socks. Axborn made a disgusted face. Borrowing my socks? Woman, you live on the very chasm's edge. At least I used to, she said. They laughed. Now hush. Axborn clamped his mouth shut, but Pierce saw him watching for a chance to butt in. It was during a lull in the Alban War, Scythia said. We'd just been hired to protect the mountain city of Idjin, just Axie and me. The others went out on their own jobs. Scouts brought word that Gen had been spotted hiding in the foothills below. Belatedly, we realised they'd been massing for quite some time. Scythia scanned Axborn, and he lifted his chin, so proud of his self-control. It's a great wonder, Pierce, Scythia said. The man lets me speak. Axborn dropped his jaw slightly, then clamped it shut again. They must have known they'd been found out, Scythia said. Or perhaps they'd finally acquired their full number. On half-year's eve, in the dead of night, they marched. Our defensive wall was little more than a scrappy redoubt made of whatever the locals had lying around. They'd never much needed protection, trusting to the narrow mountain passes to keep them safe. But they also hadn't known about the old temple and convergence buried in a sealed-off network of caves. None of us did, until after the battle. The Gen marched on us with flaming brands held aloft, bold against our meagre defences. Archers fired upon them, but their hard skin and tight chainmail conspired to keep them safe. They set the wall ablaze. It ignited like the tinder that it was, and people went to work trying to smother sections that were aflame. The rest of us prepared to fend off the inevitable breach. Idjin's mountain people are hardy and stout, but they don't take direction well, even from each other. This made them the worst possible fighting force to be in charge of. Unfortunately, we didn't know that before going in, or I would have told Axie not to take the job. Axborn shrugged and twisted up his lips. There were 500 defenders, and no sooner had the redoubt caught fire than the lot of them surged out onto the battlefield. Idjin was hemmed in by stone on 3 sides, and the forest had been cleared on the 4th, to deprive the enemy of easy cover. The mountain folk filled that space with their bodies, getting mixed up with the Gen in the worst display of tactics I've ever seen. I still don't know what they were thinking. Axborn looked like he had a comment for that, but his wife just smirked at him preemptively and he stayed quiet. Hot blood, I suppose, Scythia said. Axborn nodded. And no training. Bad combination. But Axie had a brilliant plan. The big man grinned proudly. Scythia imitated his deep voice. Listen, he said, tightening the straps of his armour. We could just jump in there and start slashing, but those mountain folk are getting slaughtered. I'm afraid we'd be overwhelmed if the others were here, but they're not. I need one of your shield gems. I gave it to him and he slapped it on his chest. I'm going to activate the shield and you're going to punch me. What? I asked. Punch me, he said, as hard as you can. If I reverse force at the right moment, the shield will throw me back instead of you and send me flying. I can land in the middle of the Gen. But you said you didn't want to be surrounded, I said. I don't want us to both be surrounded, he said. Besides, I need your strength for this idiotic plan, so I can attack from the centre instead of the sides. His plan began to take shape in my mind, for I knew almost all of his tricks, and I realised he was right. Axborn beamed. It was idiotic. He frowned and finally almost spoke, but just barely held himself. But it would work. We activated the shield and its gem began to deplete, forming a hard mass of air in front of his chest. I counted down from 3 and gave him all the force of every punch he's ever deserved. Axborn allowed himself a laugh. His timing with reverse force was perfect. I watched him grin as he hurtled away from me and drew his halberd, Scythia said. She looked at her husband. It's okay, you can say it. I'd always wanted to fly, Axborn said. He landed right in the midst of the Gen and mountain folk and sent all the force of his impact out under the feet of the latter. I'll never know how he did it that precisely. Axborn grinned. All the mountain fighters went flying up in the air and the Gen fell to their knees as if pulled down by the earth itself. Axborn went to work, laying about with the huge head of his halberd. Gen heads flew, at least a dozen slain before the mountain folk hit the ground. I had come down from the burning ramparts to help clear a path for retreat, and the mountain fighters reluctantly began to withdraw. The Gen soldiers looked like they were glued to the earth. No matter how much they struggled, they couldn't get free. I don't think either of us was sure how long the force enchantment would last, but Axborn seemed to be giving it no thought. He was merely a reaper, cutting down Gen in a dance of death. Some of them gained their feet and attacked, but they could not overcome Axborn's rampage. Others tried to flee. Axborn stomped and stuck them to the ground again. All were slain. By the time I'd gathered up all the defenders and gotten them into something resembling a formation, Axborn had finished the job. Not one Gen was left standing. We saw him striding back across the battlefield toward the city, smoke from the redoubt wafting out down the gentle slope. His face was grim, and every inch of him dripped with Gen blood. He stopped before us and let his eyes pass across the faces of Idjin's fighters. He didn't even have to say a word. One by one they began to look down in shame, knowing that though the battle had been won, they themselves had failed. When all of their eyes had been hooded, Axborn turned and walked to the stump of a large tree. He dropped his halberd down beside him and took a seat. I dismissed the Idjinites and went to kneel at Axborn's side. We didn't speak. Even now, every battle is hard. Taking life is hard. Neither of us had ever killed so much all at once, and I could only imagine how he was feeling. Axborn wasn't grinning anymore. But it had to be done, Pierce said quietly. And that's why we do it, Pierce. So others don't have to, Scythia said, putting a hand on her husband's arm. He put one of his over hers and squeezed.